Hi guys, today I want to make a response video to Professor Solberg as he responds to Tovia Singer concerning the genealogy of Jesus, because Tovia Singer claimed, and so do many other rabbis, that Jesus cannot be the Messiah if he is a virgin birth, that these do exclude each other, because it clearly states in the Tanakh that the Messiah will be of the seed or the genealogy of David. So it is quite interesting now to see what Professor Solberg had to say, how he is trying to explain this, and I will show a few clips and then I will give my comments alongside is to see, if we can agree or if it really answers the questions. I'm really excited about this because I am a Christian and I have grown up with a belief that Jesus was a virgin birth, and hearing a lot of rabbis now saying, no, this cannot be. And after studying it myself, I came to the same conclusion that it really is an issue that needs to be addressed in the church. So I would like to hear if there is a way to actually reconcile these kind of ideas that Jesus is a virgin birth and at the same time the son of David. So let's hear what Professor Solberg has to say to this first.
Scripture, as I do, knows that the issue of Yeshua's genealogy is settled in the first verse of the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament. This is the genealogy of Yeshua the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. There it is in Holy Scripture. Jesus descended from David, as was required of the Messiah. And the genealogy in Luke 3 teaches the same thing. I mean, if this was an issue in the first century, Yeshua's messianic claim would have never gotten off the ground, particularly among his first followers.
Okay, so yes, of course, Jesus is of the genealogy of David and of the tribe of Judah. That is not really what the objection is about. We have various manuscripts about the Matthew Gospel, and in most of them, and the one that we are having today, of course, the genealogy stops at Joseph, even though in the first verse it is claimed that actually the genealogy of Jesus. But there is also a Coptic version of this gospel where Joseph is the actual father of Jesus, and Jesus only became the Son of God during baptism. And that is, in my opinion, much more likely.
But of course, for Rabbi Singer and others who reject the New Testament, the genealogy of Jesus in these two Gospels is far from conclusive. In fact, it's brought up as an objection to his meeting the qualifications of the Jewish Messiah. And yes, there are differences between the two genealogies found in Matthew and Luke. And we could spend time talking about those differences and why they were each written that way, which is fascinating.
Yes, it is fascinating, I agree, but it is not just minor differences. We have total different stories in Matthew and in Luke. Let's start where Joseph and Mary lived. According to Matthew, they lived in Bethlehem before the birth, and according to Luke, they lived in Nazareth. So I don't want to go into all the details, but when we start comparing them, we realize they cannot be reconciled with each other's. Therefore, both of these stories cannot be true, and it is very questionable if any of them is true.
But the differences between the two genealogies isn't really the problem. In fact, those discrepancies are a distraction from the real point. The real problem, which we're going to focus on in this video, is this. The Tanakh clearly states that the Messiah will be a descendant of King David and from the tribe of Judah. And it also teaches that tribal affiliation flows through the Father. So, if Jesus was born of a virgin and had no earthly father, how could he be descended from David and the tribe of Judah? This is the crux of the objection.
Exactly, that is the crux of the objection. If Jesus was not born of an earthly father, how could he be a descendant of David or of the tribe of Judah? So I'm quite curious how he tries to explain how this is still possible. So let's continue listening.
And of course, Rabbi Singer and others who hold this view will argue that on this basis, Jesus couldn't possibly have been the Messiah.
Okay, Solberg continues at this point to explain the idea that Jews claim that tribal affiliation can only be passed from father to son. So I don't want to list all these, but I just want to go to the point where he makes his assumption.
The assumption that a male can never be included in the lineage of a man who wasn't his biological father is wrong.
Okay, so Professor Solberg claims point blank that the assumption that the lineage can be passed only from father to son is false. So I'm very curious to find his explanations why that is not true. So let's keep on listening to what he has to say.
Under Jewish law, tribal affiliation is typically through the birth father, but not always. There's biblical precedent in the Tanakh that a male can be included in the lineage of a man who's not his biological father. And we're going to look at a couple examples in a minute. But there's an even bigger factor that I want to mention up front. The Tanakh doesn't provide direct commandments or teachings regarding how tribal affiliation must be determined.
That's true, I guess. There is no commandment concerning how to transfer tribal affiliation. So, yes, I believe Professor Solberg has a point here, that there is no clear commandment in the scriptures of the Tanakh that says that affiliation can only be transferred from father to son. But I would still say that even though it's not clearly stated, we have to accept that this was how it usually was done. And I don't think we should how shall I say, fall into the trap to now believe that affiliations can be passed through any means and method. I mean, what exactly would then decide who is a descendant of David? Because through intermarriage, I mean, possibly if we would look at the DNA of any Jew, we might find traces of affiliation to David through the maternal line. And would that then mean that everybody could be a potential Messiah, could sit on the throne of David? Well, I would argue that the scriptures are pretty clear in that point, that what is meant is the transfer from father to son and not any other means. So it must be a direct descendant of David. But okay, let's let this stand, because he is right at this point. We don't have any clear commandment about transfer of tribal affiliation in the scriptures.
Rather, it's a pattern that we see. When the land is divided and the people are counted, they always follow the father's tribe. And this pattern makes sense, and it's naturally been adopted into Jewish law and tradition. But strictly speaking, there's no biblical mandate for how tribal affiliation must be reckoned.
I must admit, this idea of a pattern is something I've heard for the first time. And it's a very interesting one, that there are patterns in the scriptures but no clear commandments. So the question is, how do we interpret these? Are these patterns something that we can validate as being part of God's word and therefore should be followed? Or are these kind of patterns something that we can say, well, there might be exceptions to the rule, and we therefore cannot clearly determine how Jewish identity is being established. I think that would be very, very confusing, because, I mean, how do we then know what tribe somebody belongs to, unless we have a clear lineage that is somehow traced through one parent and not both parents? Now we have the custom, of course, a pattern, as Professor Solberg said, in the scriptures, that it is passed on from father to son. But now we want to make an argument that in the case of Jesus, an exception rule is being applied. And I think that is what Professor Solberg is now going into. So let's listen to what he has to say to that.
Deuteronomy 25 describes God's commands regarding levirate marriage, which is when a man dies and leaves his widow childless. In that case, the brother of the man who died is obligated to marry the widow and produce a child. And the Torah requires that the firstborn child of this levirate marriage should be counted in the genealogy of the man who died childless. If brethren shall dwell together, and one of them shall die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to him for a wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she bears shall succeed in the name of his brother who is dead, that his name may not become extinct in Israel. So levirate marriage is one way that a male can be included in the lineage of a man who isn't his biological father. And through this arrangement, the children actually become heirs of their dead father's land and possessions, and the family line is considered unbroken.
Of course, this is something I've been looking into myself, and I came to the conclusion that this cannot be really used as an example, because first of all, the brothers had to be living together, so they were kind of one family unit. They were both out of the same tribe, they had the same affiliation, the same father, and therefore, if the father then performed his duty to give his brother children, it was not stepping outside of the tribal affiliation. So this example, in my opinion, is just completely invalid, because it doesn't step outside of the tribal affiliation, and so we cannot count this as a proof that somebody can just adopt a tribe that he doesn't belong to himself.
And this is true as well in the case of adoption. So consider the case of Caleb, who was one of the 2 faithful spies that Joshua sent out to survey the promised land. In Numbers 32:12, we learn that Caleb is the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, which would make him a biological descendant of the Edomites. In other words, he wasn't from an Israelite tribe. And then in Joshua 15, we discover that, according to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, a portion among the people of Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron. So God adopted Caleb, a non-Israelite, into the tribe of Judah.
Now I must admit, this is an interesting one, and one I haven't been looking into yet. So I definitely will look into this one more. However, I still question what kind of belonging that was to the tribe of Judah. He was given a portion in the land of Judah, and he's also listed amongst the tribes there. But how much his affiliation was towards Judah, in my opinion, is a bit questionable. And I'm not quite sure whether, for example, he could be considered as an heir to Judah himself. So, like Judah, to be like of the tribe of Judah, really you had to be a son of a son of a son of a son of Judah. And Caleb wasn't, apparently. So, in that sense, even though he was given a portion amongst the tribes of Judah because of what he did, the question still remains: is he actually considered of the tribe of Judah? Or is he simply just allowed to have a portion amongst the tribes of Judah? So I would say, like, yes, this is an interesting point, and it is something definitely to look more into. Yet I would still say it's a bit borderline, and I don't think that we could really accept this as a clear indication that it is okay to transfer tribal affiliation in that way.
And there's more evidence in the genealogical tables in 1 Chronicles 2. Now, to be fair, these genealogies are somewhat confusing, and scholars are divided on whether the Caleb in this chapter is the same Caleb who accompanied Joshua.
Yes, I think if we have this kind of uncertainty which Caleb it is actually speaking about, I think we have to be very careful to use this as an example. And I do feel that Professor Solberg would agree with me on that. Okay, let's continue. And here's the next point.
The Torah also teaches that a male can be included in the lineage of a man who's not his biological father through maternal lines.
Okay, now it gets interesting. So here he outright states that the Torah teaches that you can also be included into the father's line via the maternal line. Now I'm very curious where he takes this argument from, but let's listen and hear what he has to say.
In Numbers 27, we see Zelophehad's daughters petitioning Moses after their father died. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives. So Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and give their father's inheritance to them. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter." God decreed that in certain instances, the father's name and posterity was to flow through a daughter. And this means that if she marries outside of her father's tribe, her inheritance would transfer to her husband's tribe.
Okay, yes, that's something I have been looking into myself, and because I was looking for an argument in favor of a maternal transfer of affiliation. But it doesn't speak about tribal affiliation at this point. It speaks to simply that if a father has only daughters, what happens with his inheritance? So in that case, the inheritance can be passed on to the daughter. And of course, the daughter can then pass it on to her children. Now, the question here is, what happens if she then marries outside of her tribe? Now, this is an interesting question because generally it is assumed that she would marry inside of her tribe. And since it cannot be passed on to somebody outside of the tribe, I feel like Professor Solberg here makes the assumption that the the husband, when this daughter marries, automatically then becomes part of the tribes the daughter belongs to. I don't think that is actually the case. I think it really only means that inheritance is then passed on to the daughter. And from then on, it still has to be clarified what happens if she marries now somebody outside of her tribe. Can then the inheritance be passed on to the other tribe? I don't think there is ever a question about that the husband just suddenly turns affiliation to which tribe he belongs to. So again, I cannot accept this argument because it simply doesn't speak about the transfer of tribal affiliation to another tribe or to another person of another tribe, but it speaks about inheritance only. And clearly this is, it's basically a no-go, sorry. But this one cannot be accepted at all as a proof text.
We also see this play out in 1 Chronicles 2 in the story of a man named Sheshan, who was a descendant of Judah. And in this passage, we see his genealogy continued through his daughter. Now Sheshan had no sons, only daughters. But Sheshan had an Egyptian slave whose name was Jarha. So Sheshan gave his daughter in marriage to Jarha, his slave, and she bore him Attai. Attai fathered Nathan, and Nathan fathered Zabad, and so on and so forth. All told, there are 13 generations mentioned here as the descendants of Sheshan through his daughter, and they're all recorded under the tribe of Judah. So here's the Tanakh plainly showing that tribal identity and heredity can also flow through a daughter.
Right. Okay, I think this was so far the best example that Professor Solberg gave us. But again, I think it's very far-fetched from this to assume that it is acceptable that the tribal affiliation can be passed on from father to son. There is just too little information in this part. I mean, there is no mentioning that actually this tribal affiliation was passed on to the Egyptian. There's also no mentioning in it that the affiliation was passed on to his sons. So I think, the only thing we could assume is when there was a daughter, that the daughter might marry another person from the tribe of Judah, and that their sons and would belong to or would be reckoned as descendants to the father. In that way, there is a kind of adoption process, but it would only be between people that are of the same tribe. What concerns the sons now of this Egyptian, I personally don't believe that they can be called Judeans, and I don't think that is what the text tells us. Even though they are listed in that record, doesn't automatically mean, that they belong to the tribe of Judah, as a descendant of Judah, right? I mean, they can belong to the tribe of Judah like the slaves belong to the tribe of Judah. So, because he was living with them and possibly sharing some kind of inheritance, but usually only for a period of time until his death. So if the sons now had part of the inheritance, it's very doubtable. I don't think they did. And even if it was true that would have been possible, that they would have been considered part of the tribe of Judah, that would just prove that in exceptional cases, yes, it is possible that a tribal affiliation could be passed on from mother to son. But when we look at the New Testament, it doesn't matter whether you look at Luke or whether you look at Matthew, they both only list the genealogy of Joseph. Yeah? They claim that it is of Jesus, but actually they only list it of Joseph. And there is no genealogy of Mary. I know that some people say that the genealogy of Luke is actually the one of Mary, but Luke clearly states he wants to write the genealogy of Jesus. So no matter how we turn and twist this whole thing, it just shows us that these stories, first of all, they're not compatible with each other. They're completely different stories. And second, there is no other record in the whole of the scriptures, neither in the Old Testament nor in the New Testament, that even mentions a virgin birth. Yeah. Okay, with the exception of a translation of young woman in the Septuaginta, we don't really have any record. Neither Paul speaks about the virgin birth, nor James, nor Peter. I mean, even Mark's gospel, why would he not mentioning a virgin birth if it's that important? What they all mention on all of the gospel is a baptism scene. And we have a Coptic version of the Nativity in Matthew, where Joseph clearly is a father, and where it is very clear that the sonship was only given during baptism. And the reason why the baptism scene is so important is, I believe, because that is where Jesus was made a son of God. It was kind of what Samuel did to David when he anointed him while Shaul or Saul was still king. Yeah, and in the same way, I believe that during the baptism, Jesus was made the king of the Jews, while we still had Roman authorities ruling over this area. Yeah, so he was made a king, and when Pilate crucified him, it was clearly written in 3 languages that he is crucified as a king of the Jews, because Rome would not tolerate a rival king. For me, it's just a no-brainer, really. Jesus is the King of Kings. He's the Lord of Lords. It does not diminish anything if he's not a virgin birth. In fact, it makes it much more likely that he is not a virgin birth, because he was tempted in all things as we are tempted. If he was God's son, then what would it have meant when he went to the desert to be tempted by the devil? Because as God cannot be tempted. You see, if Jesus went in the desert as God's son, or as God, in a sense, as most Christians understand it, that wasn't any temptation for him. But yet Jesus was tempted because he was a man who had 2 parents, and that is what makes Jesus so special, because he overcame sin as a normal person, a person like you and me. And that, I think, does not diminish anything about Jesus. In fact, it exalts Jesus even more. Anyway, that's all what I can say to this. But anyway, I want to thank Professor Solberg. I still think it was a very good analysis, but I just don't agree with his assumption. I don't believe that it proves anything that we clearly, it would need much more evidence, and it would be much clearer for this even to be considered in the least, to be true.